Welcome to our first keynote on stage 2 here, the role of Edtech in creating a post-pandemic future. Very excited to welcome our next speaker, Mr. John Bellosilo, all the way from the Philippines, because the corona pandemic obviously disrupted all of our lives very quickly, and especially the education sector has been hit by this pandemic because schools had to shut down, tools weren't available all of the sudden, and in general, the infrastructure was not ready for this pandemic. So John Bellosilo is concurrently the head of institutional planning at the National Teachers College of iPeople Inc., which is the main education holdings company from the Philippines. And he's here to tell us, or he's remotely here, to tell us what edtech companies especially can do to ensure that no one gets left behind. He's been in the education sector for over 10 years, with 8 years in operations and strategy and 3 years in private equity, which means he's the perfect expert to tell us more about how edtech can create a post-pandemic future. Welcome, John.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for the introduction. So let me just start first by saying I'm deeply grateful to be here and to share the story of emerging markets, specifically focusing on the Philippines. And I know I only have 15 minutes, so I will try to insert as many stories or information as best as I can given the limited time. And if you guys have questions or clarifications, you guys can reach out to me after this talk. So a bit about me, I've been in the education sector, I think now 11 years, more or less. And I work with iPeople, which is the listed education holding company of the Ayala Group of Companies, which is the oldest conglomerate in the Philippines, and the Yuchenko Group of Companies, which is one of the largest conglomerates also in the Philippines. Both of them have interests in real estate, banking, with telcos, and a lot of other businesses. So iPeople was born out of the merger between AC Education and the Mapua educational system. And AC Education focused more on the budget space, as you can see here, like the National Teachers College, Apex Schools. So the National Teachers College is the top low-cost teachers college in the country. Apex Schools is the largest high school. University of Nueva Cáceres is one of the top universities in the Bicol region, south of Manila. Mapua University is the #1 STEM university in the country, together with its subsidiaries, Malayan Laguna, best in the Laguna area, and Malayan Mindanao. Then they also have Malayan High School of Science. So I try to give my perspective as holistic as possible, coming from strategy, transformation, operations, and investments. So my great joy is when I'm able to help schools develop and implement robust strategies so that they can improve the quality of life of their students. So feel free to link up on LinkedIn after if you have any more questions or clarifications. So again, like what the host mentioned, I'll focus on education problems. And a lot of things that people make a mistake on when it comes to edtech in emerging markets is they focus more on the tech, not whether or not if they're able to get the ed through. So I'll be focusing on what happened in the Philippines to give you a clearer picture, and our neighboring regions, but of course to double click here. And I'll show you where you guys can best help in creating a better future for those developing countries. So my talk will show you how things are in the past and in the present, and we'll end up with questions in the future. We'll look at these enduring realities. So while COVID has jolted a lot of people, A lot of things will not change rapidly. One of which is poor infrastructure. I think we have one of the slowest internet connectivities and unreliable internet connectivities in the region, or if not in the world. And it's a bit expensive if you put it relatively versus minimum wage of a person. People in the education sector in emerging markets, especially Philippines, tend to be by nature resistant to change. They prefer the status quo. And while there's a more digital generation Z, they're more digital natives, there's still a lot of those who cannot afford the digital lifestyle. And yes, today we're facing competition from all sides. We have bottom, wherein public education is expanding in the tertiary level, especially sideways. Other schools are trying to come up with different value propositions. International brands are coming in or are becoming more accessible at lower price points. And there are substitutes like boot camps, which can eat the degree's lunch, like what Google is trying to do. So there are four categories that we can take a look at. One would be the regulated space and the rigid space. So Philippines, in terms of its education systems, heavily regulated. We couldn't increase fees technically without asking for permission or blessing from a education regulator in the Philippines. It's either CHED, Commission on Higher Education for tertiary, for the universities, colleges, and professional schools, and K-12 schools under the Department of Education. So we have the relatively loose but still regulated, like homeschooling, alternative learning systems, and other distance learning providers, those who provide degrees without you having to step foot inside a school. And we look at the realities of the rigid but not as regulated, like corporate training and mandated training based on certain, let's say, Banco Central or central bank regulations, and continuing professional development. And we look at the self-driven Filipino and his education for personal development, his hobbies, or either for career advancement or shifting. So how was life before the pandemic? Predominantly, the Philippines is brick and mortar. Nobody wanted to do or invest much in the digital infrastructure because they believe that real learning happens only in the classroom. So teaching done face-to-face, if ever they wanted to do something tech or tech-oriented, they'd invest in systems like school management system or learning management system, but it was only up to there. Distance and blended learning was in the fringes, and luckily, one of our schools, Mapua University, was one of those who was the pioneer of digital or distance learning in the Philippines. So we started distance learning in the early 2000s, and because of that capability, the university was able to continue its learning despite having typhoons, bomb threats, or any school interruptions. For corporates or the professionals, face-to-face was their norm. A lot of them, if they had blended learning or distance learning, it was maybe 20% maximum for these big corporates. They still believe that quality came from the classroom type of education or face-to-face coaching. So big brands like INSEAD cater to big companies like Ayala Corporation. And for those who cannot afford premium education from these global brands, they usually go to top local providers who offer face-to-face programs. Then COVID-19 happened, and it basically destroyed the foundation of what was built then. So I'll share with you some headlines as to what's happening in the Philippines right now. Basically, the private education sector is heavily battered. We don't see like maybe 50%, more than that is good for our enrollment. Public education originally supposed to start in June, but moved it to August, then moved it to October. Homeschooling now starting to become mainstream, not just for the parents who are very hands-on with regard to their kids' education. You'll also see unemployment worsening, and therefore people trying to upskill themselves to look at jobs or to get remote work. Parents and students haven't fully adjusted to the distance way. They're trying to call for an academic freeze. And yes, schools are shutting down. So what happened, or what's happening? People aren't ready. And when I say people, that's the school owners, administrators, leaders, teachers, parents, and the students themselves. So a lot of the mistakes that they made while having zero tech or very minimal tech is they tried to buy technology thinking that whatever they buy would really help them. A clear example was they invested or tried to work with this virtual laboratory company, and they got a few thousand licenses, only for them to see and realize later on that the students cannot afford the particular hardware needed to run that software. So a lot of people are investing in Zoom, Microsoft Teams, etc., thinking that life is the same when you bring the classroom to the Zoom or the virtual world. The professional education, we see that they're slowly adapting. They're in search for a lot of solutions and digital alternatives. A lot of them are creating from scratch or looking for providers to create from scratch. And since there's minimal interaction, let's say in the banking sector, they're trying to digitally transform their processes. But at the same time, they want to convert their people from transactional employees to focus more on sales. In terms of alternative education, again, what was mentioned earlier, it's becoming more mainstream. It's estimated that 10 times more inquiries versus the usual with regard to having homeschooling. And those specifically designed for digital. And self-driven education is on the rise. One of the company's learning platforms under Degree reported a 4 times increase in engagement in their online self-paced non-required learning in the first month when the lockdown happened. So if that was the present right now, if you see that there's so many problems and a lot of which are not solved by the current tech or perhaps may not have the current mindset, what should be the future like? Maybe will there be a pandemic, or will we go back to normal? And the bet we're making is that things won't go back to normal. And if they do, the stigma of being scared about potential health and safety risks will also increase. Perhaps there's not going to be full-time face-to-face anymore. It's going to be more blended. It's going to be more self-driven. Now, I'll share with you what are the questions that matter if you're trying to penetrate the emerging market, especially the Philippines. And what problems can you solve so that you maybe can make money at the same time, can make a difference in the lives of people. The biggest issue that we have, I think, in the traditional education vertical is teachers are not ready. So how can we ensure that teachers are equipped with the right tools to do distance learning correctly, according to the needs of the market and the needs of, let's say, somebody in the upper tier of the market, and their pockets are different from those who have less in life. So how do we create solutions and help teachers discern those differences? The second would be distance classes. How can we run synchronous classes and activities at a distance and ensure that the platform is network or bandwidth friendly? Maybe the cost of internet, I think it's roughly $3 for 10 gigabytes, and that's a promo rate. We were able to negotiate working with Zoom and working with Globe Telecom to have a better promo or rates for distance learning, wherein it's embedded in a particular promo because its IPs are static. So when you enter a particular market and you have a digital solution and your IPs are dynamic, it's hard for a telco to make you part of their whitelist. So I hope you keep that in mind when you think about penetrating the emerging markets for your EdTech solution. The next is, of course, engaging learners in the traditional education setting is how do we help them learn and enjoy at the same time? There's a lot of Zoom burnout in the sense that teachers think that they do the same thing in the classroom in Zoom, they're going to get the same results. But they don't realize that, the students are not as engaged. The students are just watching their Netflix while listening to the teacher, and they're totally detached. And you can't really assure learning happens. Another for the institutions themselves is how can you help them transform quickly and seamlessly and easily? Because a lot of them have undocumented, antiquated processes and systems. So a lot of solutions that we were able to do were fragmented. We were able to get a provider, let's say GCash, which is a mobile wallet in the Philippines, because we couldn't collect money for the first, I think, 4 months. Because up to now, nobody is allowed to enter the schools. So online payment is very important for cash flow. Digital payments such as Dragon Pay, Easy Pay help in the sustainability of the school. And school management systems like data mobility, which we've got for our teachers' college, is important because only then that we're able to do online enrollments. But if you look at it, it's fragmented. The next is education financing. And there are only 2 players in the Philippines, which are Invested and Bukas. While they're both doing a good job, there's still opportunity in the market for education finance. For alternative education is how do we unstress the parents? A solution that's in between homeschooling and face-to-face. And what's a new way that we can do distance? Maybe something like Smartly or Biju, but something more engaging to achieve outcomes and not primarily talking heads. Another is what's a low-cost option? Because a lot of people will be displaced. A lot of people will not be able to go to school, but the current alternative learning system may not be enough for them. So for professionals, of course, it's really micro-credentials, but something more cost-effective and locally tuned relative to LinkedIn, SAP, and other online courses. And another for learning culture, what's a B2B solution that we can help with corporates? For other continuing professional development courses, what's a distance program that's worth my time? Because there are a lot of programs, but you can only count as to which ones might be worth your time or not. For the self-driven learner, since there's a lot of unemployment, is how can you help them upskill? How can you help them transition careers without having to go back to school? Maybe like a boot camp, which is not as known in my side of the world. For ubiquitous learning, how can we have micro learning like Duolingo? Something that they can access anytime and according to when they want things or aligned with their personal hobbies. And lastly, while not really education specific, but how can we help with mental health? How can we help them get unstuck? Something like a Consulta MD, but doesn't talk to doctors, but focus primarily on counselors. So I try to, pack everything in this limited time. But I just like to make a point that, products are sold or services are sold because they really solve a problem or fill a need. It's not because of the tech. So understanding the problems, like which I've shown you, and needs involves understanding the customers and what makes them tick. So I hope that you guys learned from this time that I shared with you and gladly answer whatever questions you have or feel free to reach out to me. And thank you and have a good day.
Thank you, John, for this insightful talk. Thank you, everyone joining us here on site, as well as people who joined online. We're now just in time ready for lunch. So thank you again, John and everyone here, if you want to join for lunch, that's sited outside. For the people who have booked a ticket only for the first half of the day, please remember to keep the distance of at least 1.5 meters when you leave the building. And again, just a friendly reminder that we're still in the middle of a global pandemic, so please keep wearing your masks and wear them so they cover both mouth and nose. Not like most people in Berlin like to do it down here. They're supposed to cover your nose as well. And then afterwards, we'll be back here again with the Edtech panel, Crossing Borders for Education. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening.